Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast, where we answer key questions in dating, relationships, success, and fulfillment, and explore the psychology of masculinity. Now, here's your host, world-renowned therapist and life coach, David Tian.
Welcome to the Masculine Psychology Podcast. I am your host, David Tian. And in this episode, we'll be getting into what a sexually attractive good man is like and how you can become that, how any nice guy can become that, so that he can become naturally attractive to women without compromising his moral principles. So in the last episode, we covered the origins of the nice guy strategy. We explored how the nice guy strategy flows out of a pleaser strategy, and specifically a pleaser-fixer type of strategy, and that this is a result of a parentified childhood where there was enmeshment with the parent figure or parent figures, and a pattern of boundary violations where the parent is violating the child's boundary by making the child feel responsible for the parent's feelings and emotional state, and that this led to toxic shame, and that's as a result of the toxic shame, a kind of coping mechanism was to kind of shut down the emotions or awareness of one's emotions and stick with the coping strategy that worked to get the child's needs met, which was a kind of fixer mentality or a fixer strategy. And then in adulthood, that gets translated into a nice guy strategy. And then when it comes to dating, the nice guy strategy doesn't work because it doesn't generate sexual attraction. And I looked at the key questions of whose love did you crave the most growing up, and a sequence of questions that are very important as kind of cheat codes to figuring all of this out, especially the family of origin issues. So I highly recommend you go back to the last episode if you missed it and go through that because there's a lot of detail in that. And then we ended with sexual shame as a component of the nice guy strategy overall. So that was the last episode. In this episode, we're looking at specifically the what of what's it look like to be a good man and still be sexually attractive, or even more, to be sexually attractive as a result of being a good man, even more than that, not just despite being good, but as a part of being good. And why is this important? Because I know a lot of my followers, a lot of our listeners here, a lot of people who write into me want to attract women in an ethical way. And this is part of why they have defaulted to a nice guy strategy, other than the fact, which is a much more important factor, that this is how they have learned unconsciously now, it's become an unconscious strategy, to get love or get attention and approval and affection, that then naturally this would get carried over into the dating context, but also because they care about being moral and they don't see any other way. And there's a big problem here because there's a lot of guys who start off as nice guys. In other words, well-meaning guys who were parentified children growing up. So this is the main way that they learned how to get attention and the love and the connection that we all need growing up. These are fundamental human needs. There's nothing to be ashamed about. These are needs that we all have. But that for a nice guy were met in ways that are unhealthy in the long term. And became maladaptive. The ways that they had settled on getting these needs met became maladaptive in adulthood. And then nice guys starting out realizing over and over that their nice guy strategy is not getting them what they want, attraction from the women that they want attraction from. So they're nice to these women, hoping that, this is largely unconscious for nice guys who haven't learned what we've been covering here in these episodes. This unconscious strategy to get the woman to like them. But it backfires because it's a different pathway. Guilting a woman into liking you or pitying you is not going to lead to sexual attraction. So then they become bitter and resentful when all of this work that they put into it has been going into the wrong bucket or down the wrong channel, down the wrong road. And they don't realize that. They don't see any other way. They don't see the right road. They don't see the other pathways to getting sexual attraction. So then they just give up. They get really bitter and angry as a result that all the hard work they're putting into it is not paying off. And then they end up becoming fodder for incel subcultures or MGTOW or red pill. And it's fed by this kind of negative energy of anger and resentment and a lot of pain from being hurt over and over and basically just not understanding how to get their needs met in healthy ways. Okay, so you don't want that for your life. You don't want to go down the road of this bitterness and anger and resentment and the kind of self-destructive energy and having your life fueled by a kind of hate. It doesn't feel nice, actually. Even if you succeed, even if the incel succeeds in starting I don't know, what do they call that? Like a revolution or something like that, right? So they end up like, or even the MGTOW ends up succeeding in sacrificing his relationships, because basically that's what they give up on the relationships. So they sacrifice love and connection in any deep sense. And they just settle for short-term, just basically orgasms and just basically sex. And they're sacrificing all of that in the hopes that women will see their social protest and then take pity on them. Like, oh, okay, we'll change our ways because all of you men in MGTOW and have checked out. That's not going to happen. That's not happening. That's not happened through all of history. And women won't generally even notice that you have exited yourself out of competition there, out of being chosen, because they weren't really looking at you anyway. And then the red pill is this sort of angry way of dealing with it, of getting revenge, getting even. And you can see, if you were to enter inside the psychology of those movements, that there's no room for happiness and fulfillment and peace and contentment and, more importantly, love. And I don't want that for you. I don't want you to go down that dark road. Some people who have already been down that dark road will maybe be angry. I don't know why they're listening to this, but maybe there's hope for you, because if you're listening to this and you've gone down that road, there must be a part of you that's saying, this isn't all there is. We don't have to give in to this darkness. There is another way. So before I get into the 5 points I've got for today on the what, I just want to remind us of the myths. The nice guy myth, first of all, that bending over backwards for her will generate sexual attraction from her. Okay, that's just total myth. That doesn't work. There's different pathways, love and sexual attraction. And I've made whole other video seminars and episodes about that. So I'm just going to leave that there if it's not obvious to you. If it's not obvious to you yet, and you just still think maybe they could, that sort of guilting a woman by doing lots of favors for her will generate sexual desire in her, then go ahead and try it out and then come back to this. I don't think there needs to be that much proof for it. You can just go and try it. And then pointing out the false dichotomy that feeds the nice guy strategy, which is that there's no other choice. That it's either you be nice in the way of, like, being nice isn't really the issue. It's what a nice guy is, being nice in order to trigger reciprocation on the other party. So being nice with this underlying motive, or being an arrogant, shallow airhead. Those aren't the only choices. This is a false dichotomy. And instead, the correct contrast that I brought out in the last episode is being good versus being nice. Good versus nice. Morally good versus merely nice. Okay, so it's really important to keep that in mind as we proceed here. So now we get into the 5 points that I want to share to illustrate for you the what it's like to be a good man and still be sexually attractive, so that you're not an arrogant, shallow airhead. And you're not also someone who's nice merely to, or mostly to, generate or trigger reciprocation, or that in order for you to feel good about being nice, it needs to result in the other person being nice back to you. And I know actually many nice guys are religious conservatives or have a religious background. So this reminded me of a Bible verse from Luke, which is, let's see if I can remember this. If you are kind only to someone who is kind to you, will God be pleased with you for that? Even sinners are kind to people who are kind to them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Now, you may not be Christian, or you may not have a Christian background. You can find a similar idea in pretty much every major religion, and it just makes sense. This is just baked into also moral philosophy, ethics, the history of ethics. So this is just obvious. If you are kind only because you want others to be kind to you, there's no merit in that. This is not morally good per se. Everyone does that. Even evil people do that. So the first point out of 5 is to get clear on what your moral values actually are, to get clear on what your theory of good is, what constitutes goodness for you. And one of the things that you'll come across as you do more thinking in ethical theory or moral philosophy is that this notion of niceness that is built into the nice guy strategy is devoid of moral merit. So then you've got to have something to take its place. What is your moral system? And this is, I'm not going to be able to point out, work out a whole theory for you here in this half-hour podcast, but I have made 3 other episodes in this podcast before, episodes 4, 5, and 6, that dive deep into moral values. So at least you have the beginnings of, or a kind of guide to get you started on thinking about the type of moral values that are necessary for a successful long-term relationship. If in fact a long-term relationship is what you want, then it's important to know what values are necessary to make that work. So I cover that in episodes 4, 5, and 6 of the Masculine Psychology podcast. I reference those. I also have made many seminar videos on values, virtues, and vices, and all of that moral philosophy. I'm planning to do a lot more in the future, hopefully maybe writing a book about it down the road, this year's down the road. So there's a lot to say about this, but I'm just going to point out it's important that you work out your moral values. And you could start with an ethics class. I don't know if you need to take a whole class or how helpful a particular class would be, but that's how I started off in university, studying moral philosophy, starting with Aristotle and Kant and Hume and Nietzsche and so on. Also studying in the Asian tradition. I would especially point out to you the importance of studying Confucianism and Taoism. And so this might turn people off right at the beginning. I have to study stuff. Yeah, it helps to do that. I am an intellectual person. I have many intellectual parts that enjoy reading and studying and philosophizing. If you don't, you're going to be at a disadvantage here. And this is one of the reasons why you're not able to find happiness and you're not able to be very rooted in who you are, so that you're just kissing ass to women, finding out, what is she like? Oh, I'll be like that. And then wishy-washy, going here to there just based on what she wants. And then you have not rooted, not grounded. Well, don't be surprised when women and people don't respect you because you're just a chameleon. You haven't figured out what you stand for. So that's important. This is part of what university is supposed to be giving you. Those 4 years, this is kind of a luxury. Of course, when you're 18, you don't realize it's a luxury. You think it's an onerous task to study for exams and things like that. As you get older, and you might have heard this, if you're a young person still in university, you might have heard older people tell you that it's a luxury what you get to experience there, but it really is. This is supposed to be the time when you get to do nothing but think about the meaning of life and philosophize, and you have the freedom to read Nietzsche and Kant and so forth. You're going to have to carve out that time when you have a job off of company hours. Generally speaking, you will not be paid to read Kant unless you become a professor like I did, because I loved that luxury, that time so much that it would be great to get paid to be doing research and writing. And it's kind of self-indulgent in a way. I don't think most academics realize just how self-indulgent their lives, their careers are, and how much they're dependent on the good graces of the taxpayer. But if you're an adult now and you need to do the ethical theory now as an adult, there are a lot of resources online. You can start with the philosophy. I found that when I've suggested this to people, what the nice guy is going, or like the average person is going into this research project of figuring out their values, thinks moral philosophy is like just a list of commandments. Like if they're looking for the new 10 commandments or something, thou shalt not steal. So that's not a good way to approach ethics. You start from first principles and work your way up. You could go the other direction of here's some moral commandments and then looking for the moral principles to undergird them. But it's not going to be probably the way you think it is, which is like just injunctions of do this, don't do that, because that's not philosophy. That's just really that's just like obeying codes, moral codes. And that's not very sophisticated. So thinking about what is the meaning of life? What are the greater principles? Why do we exist? Why be good at all? Starting from there, there's a lot of books on this. There's an encyclopedia of philosophy. So I just start you there. Maybe I will include and put together a reading list for those who are interested. If you're interested, put it in the comments or write to me and email me and let me know that that's something you're interested in. I don't want to bore people who are more interested in the dating stuff. So anyway, first point, values. And by the way, I go into a step-by-step process to guide you into discovering your current set of values, because it's not that you have no values at all. You have a system, a moral value system. If you haven't thought about it, you just don't know what it is. But you've already imbibed one. You've maybe adopted one that was just foisted on you in the background. And it might come from your teachers, your parents, or what you would perceive your society to say. And you just adopted it as a child unquestioningly. And now as an adult, you're still operating with that. And it's uncritical because you haven't criticized it. You haven't looked at it and evaluated it with a critical eye. So it's important to realize that you have a value system. So we start with that in my course, Invincible. There's a process that I guide you through that you unearth your current value system, and then you get to look at it. Is this what you want to actually be guiding your life? And then through a process of questioning there and coming out of your unconscious again, what actually are the values that you'll want to adopt to live the life you want to live? And there's a process for that. And that's in my course, Invincible. And I also touch on values and needs in my other big courses like Rock Solid Relationships, especially now because you have to think about your wife or your girlfriend or your spouse's values, your partner's values, as well as your own. You got to get to know those. You got to be able to suss those out of her, and ideally before you get into a relationship with her, in case there's a big value clash. And you got to get that out on the table. It's not that that's a done deal, but it is a big deal. So it's important that you know what her values are. And if you don't even know what your own values are, there's no way you're going to figure out what her values are. So now you have a double task, and we cover that in Rock Solid Relationships. And it's also in Freedom U and Lifestyle Mastery. So if you want to go through a guided process on figuring out your values and figuring out what values would work best for the life that you want to live, or the priorities that you have and the kind of meaning in your life that you ascribe to it, then take my courses, Invincible, Rock Solid Relationships, Freedom U, Lifestyle Mastery. Those will all help you with that. They'll guide you through that process. You can also join the Platinum Partnership and get access to all of them. Okay, so that's the first point out of 5. Get clear on your moral values. Otherwise, you have no ground to stand on. So just as an aside, the Red Pill, MGTOW, Incel guys are criticizing other people, constantly attacking others. And I'm just going to try to gently point out to them, they have no ground to stand on because they're not clear on their set of moral values. What makes their position, more meritorious than this other position? They've got to get clear on that. And I think just in the process of getting clear on their ethical theory, on what constitutes goodness, it will present to them why their position is indefensible as well. So anyway, just get them started on that. What is the place of empathy and compassion, etc.? Okay, so values. Okay, so that's the first point. The second is, and I can't emphasize how important the first point is. Okay, so just want to point that out. The second is that what is it like when a good man is also sexually attractive? A good man is also sexually comfortable. So that's the second point. The first one is he's a man of values, and he understands what his moral values are. And he tries to follow them as closely as possible. And when he deviates from them, he apologizes and makes amends if he can. The second point is that he's comfortable with his sexuality, right? And he understands that sex and sexuality is a healthy biological need. It's a normal biological need. It's a biological need and urge that when we get shot full of testosterone, we as men get horny. And, when we go through puberty, we start to get these urges. This is normal. This is natural. This is a good thing. This is how we propagate as a species, sex. Sex itself is not a dirty, evil, sinful act. Okay, so there's a lot of that residual sexual shame, even in those who are not religious, because it's just in your society. Because many of our societies have the vestiges of a kind of judgmental religion that shames the sexual act for all kinds of other reasons that I don't want to get into right now. But it's just important to notice that there is the sexual shame. I had a clear break in my late 20s, early 30s from being an evangelical Christian to not being an evangelical Christian. And I made that break with a lot of philosophical arguments. So I presented papers at the Society of Christian Philosophy at multiple conferences on my arguments for why I had problems with the conservative Christian faith. And I didn't get any good answers. As a result, eventually it became obvious to me that, and I'm not voicing this on anyone else, you don't have to leave the faith or anything to leave the Christian faith or anything like that, to be a good man who is also sexually attractive. I'm just saying for me, intellectually, my intellectual parts were so strong that once I gave intellectual assent to the fact that all of that old baggage of sexual shame from conservative Christianity wasn't true. It comes from a place that's false. It was relatively easy to just jettison that. So when I felt it, any kind of sexual shame, I would just realize, oh, that's not true. So then I'll just leave it alone. Just like if I think that the earth is flat, but I know intellectually that it's not, whenever I look out onto the earth and I see the flatness of it, and I say, oh, I'm tempted to think maybe, oh, the earth is flat. I just know, I understand why I think it's flat. If I were to look at it from a distance, from a proper perspective, I would see that it's round. So I don't let myself get sucked into the old views. And it was relatively easy for me to jettison that. However, I still needed help from a therapeutic perspective with sexual shame because I had young parts that were sexually shamed, that I had kind of neglected, that I've kind of just run roughshod over while developing my persona, which I'll cover in the next episode of how you can do that, developing my persona of being sexually comfortable, where there was young parts in me, inner child parts in me that were not sexually comfortable because they were they were scolded by mom for whenever there was like a nude scene that came up in a video that we were watching as a family, because we watched a lot of action movies. And it wasn't my fault. I didn't know this was going to come up in the video or in the movie, but I was the one who was scolded, told to leave the room, go back to, it was like punished by going back to my room. We weren't able to watch the movie, that sort of thing. And that boy who felt like sex was something that was forbidden, taboo, not even just the sexual act, but just being naked and having lustful thoughts, right, from a vestige of Christianity, was sinful. And I was able to let go of that. And here's something interesting. You can still be a conservative Christian and be sexually comfortable within the limits of what your religion allows. So, I tease my evangelical Christian friends. I still have a lot of friends from way back then, some of whom are in the ministry. And I tease them that you guys should have a sex shop for Christians, because within marriage, you have to be able to get it up, but you got to consummate the marriage. This is a good thing within evangelical Christianity, right? You got to propagate the species. So in order for the male to be able to physically do that, he's got to think lustful thoughts. Oh, now lustful thoughts are okay within the conditions of the marriage, as obviously the Song of Solomon shows. So there is a context in which you can have lustful thoughts about your wife or husband. Well, in that context, why wouldn't you bring in other aids? You wouldn't have movies depicting other people having sex, but you could have sex toys, you could have other kinds of things. Anyway, it's just there is room for sexuality. And I'm sure there's somebody out there who does that sort of thing. I don't know how much traction they'd be getting in the community, considering how much sexual shame there is in conservative, especially Christianity. But there is a place for it. Now, in other religions, I'm not sure how much there is. You'd have to figure that out for yourself. I'm not going to speak for other religions. I'm just going to point out that I was able to surmount a lot of the detrimental effects of sexual shame through pure intellectualizing and realizing, just intellectually, that sex is a biological need and urge, and there are many ways in which it is a healthy expression of a natural urge. And it becomes unhealthy when there's not consent, or maybe in a casual sex context that you're not practicing safe sex. So other than those cases, sex and just having sex and sexuality, exploring sex and lustful thoughts, so to speak, those are required generally to get it up, to actually consummate the sexual act. Those are all healthy biological urges. And there's absolutely no reason for there to be sexual shame. And when you do feel that, you can understand why, because of your society's vestiges of religious shame and all of that. And then you can dismiss it. Now, I mentioned there are therapeutic processes that I underwent later on, several years into being sexually comfortable, where I had kind of run roughshod over or had just kind of ignored these inner child parts that were still holding that sexual shame. So I was luckily enough able to work with my therapist to help unburden those parts. And now there's very little urgency around getting laid. And this was several years ago. So there was a lot of freedom and liberation there, where there wasn't the kind of urgency that a teenager might have, but instead being comfortable with sexual expression and sexuality and having no neediness or anxiety around it. So that's the second point I want to make, that the what of a good man who is sexually attractive is not only a man who is living according to his values, but also is sexually comfortable and is not judgmentalizing or moralizing around sex. Do you struggle in your interactions with women or in your intimate relationship? Are fear, shame, or neediness sabotaging your relationships or attractiveness? In my Platinum Partnership program, you'll discover how to transform your psychological issues, improve your success with women, and uncover your true self. Get access to all my current and future online courses by applying for the Platinum Partnership today at davidtianphd.com/platinum. 3 more points relatively quickly here because these are character traits. The third point is that he's easygoing, that he's not giving into fears or stress. Often it's the pleaser is more thinking in terms of stress. So I'll notice that a lot of nice guys are actually really uptight. They're walking around with a lot of worries and concerns. And you can still be a good man and get clear on your values. And as you get clear on your values, you notice that a lot of things, well, it really depends on your value system. Like you can have a value system that leads to evil. Like you could break down Hitler's value system. There's a value system there. So I don't want to just say if you have a value system, you're going to be easygoing. But a well thought out value system, almost all good value systems will lead to the realization that most things in life are not deal breakers. They're actually not that important. Most of these decisions that you think are end all and be all decisions are actually not that way at all. And as you think through your values, you realize that, okay, things aren't that bad. Like, okay, if, for instance, they decriminalize marijuana, and my conservative Christian family is very anti-drugs for other reasons, but part of it is as part of the ecosystem of the whole no drinking, no sex, no lustful thoughts, basically no hedonism and pleasure, right? And part of that is this fear of drugs. And even just something as mild as marijuana, that, okay, so I don't know what that would be like if it were to be decriminalized, though I can, when it happened, this was a few years ago, because Canada, I think, was the first country to actually fully decriminalize it. And when it happened, I was like, okay, let's see what happens here. Because part of it is my default as an attractive person is to be easygoing and laid back. Let's see what's going to happen here. And when you get down to it, almost all of those fears that these nice guys are carrying around can be traced back to a fear of death. And you might think that's reasonable to be afraid of death. And I would say, no, it's actually not. You just haven't done your philosophy far enough. And I've done a 4-video series on the denial of death and how almost all of our neurotic patterns are a result of an extreme fear of death, and dealing with that, coming to terms with it, creates a lot of neurotic patterns. This goes beyond the scope of this particular episode. I'm trying to keep it down to half an hour, but I've done other videos. Like I've said, I've done a 4-video series. I realize that went over the heads of most of the listeners. So in some future point, I might dive deeper into values and into death. And I don't know how far afield I can go in this, into philosophy, before I lose a lot of listeners. So I'm just going to put it out there. Being easygoing is really sexy. And you can be easygoing, laid back, and realizing that most things that you are worrying and stressing about aren't that big of a deal. And you can let all of this other shit slide if you get clear on what are the most important values. Alleviating unnecessary suffering, prioritizing love, things like that. Getting clear on what is the good will help you to relax, actually, because you realize that most of the things you're stressing about, like getting that promotion at work or what will people think of me, right? None of that actually matters with just a cursory diving into of moral philosophy or of values. And then if your intellectual parts are strong enough, then they will be able to take you to the point where the therapeutic work can just take over. But you can already, up to that point, claim back for yourself a lot of freedom, sexual freedom, emotional freedom, and have that kind of easygoing nature. And I'll show you how to do that. I can share with you a process that I underwent for how to do that in the next episode. But I just want to point out the what. Easygoing, being laid back. It's really important to being sexually attractive as a man. And a lot of nice guys are not, because they're just full of fear, because they feel like if they don't check all of those boxes, then mommy or daddy or the parent figure, there will be negative consequences for that. Even though in the here and now, it's not true, but because it's easy to trigger them for these fears, and they regress to an earlier childhood mentality or mindset or set of neural pathways, that they're lost in that fear unconsciously and not even realizing it. So that's the third point, being easygoing. The fourth is being adventurous. So this is sort of like the more active part of this easygoing mindset. Easygoing is sort of like, yeah, just let it slide, man, just lay back more, not freaking out or stressed about a lot of things, taking the bigger perspective. Being adventurous is taking that extra step, being a little bit more of a risk taker. And this is something you can do. And this is even if you're, or maybe especially if you're a good man, because you know where the edges of that risk are, where healthy risk is. And it's important to realize that bad boys who might be more risk taking, they might be, the type that might have tattoos, might ride motorcycles, doing things that are more dangerous than the average. And it's not morally bad to take slightly more risks. It's not morally bad to be adventurous, but it gets lumped in there with the sort of uptight approach to life that nice guys generally tend to have. And if you want to be more sexually attractive and be a good man, it's important to work in there and figure out clearly where is the room of your comfort zone for adventure, and to widen that threshold of comfort with being more adventurous. Engaging in activities or behaviors that are a little bit more on the wild side, a little bit more adventurous. Get clear on where that is according to your moral values. Now, you might adopt a moral value system that says that anything that is fun is sinful. Well, I challenge you on that moral value system. Where are you getting this definition of good, and how does it hold up? Are you just getting it from a Bible or something like that? Or are you actually thinking through it from first principles? Because I think that'd be very difficult to defend, that fun is in some way evil or bad. So get clear on where that line is for you and see if you can enlarge that threshold for risk, for adventure. And you'll find that you become a lot sexier as a man. And then finally, the fifth point is assertiveness. A lot of nice guys have a lot of trouble with assertiveness because problems with assertiveness are rooted in toxic shame. They're not rooted in not knowing what to say. As always, the problem with most guys is very basic, like, duh, duh, duh. I think it's just what to say. But obviously, no, it's a lot deeper than that. And the problem with not knowing what to say, I mean, you know the language that you're going to speak, so it's not like you don't know the words. It's getting the emotional courage and the right mental state to be able to say it without having to bank on a lot of emotion. I think nice guys, when they have to be assertive or when they feel like they have to be assertive, get really angry or nervous and anxious, and they channel that anxiety into kind of anger, and then they overcorrect way too much, and they come off angry. And that's to them assertive. And then they feel like when they're assertive, they're being aggressive and like a jerk and like all of the guys that they didn't like growing up, the popular guys or whatever. And then they think, oh, if you're assertive, you know what, you're arrogant. So no, that's not true. Being assertive is simply holding your boundaries, and you don't even have to have any emotion around that. In fact, you can be assertive while feeling sorry for the other person because you know that that person either hasn't been taught proper boundaries, hasn't been taught manners, or maybe is dealing with so much pain that they're violating other people's boundaries as a result of trying to deal with their own pain. So you could still hold the line without all this anger, without any anger. And it's simply just stating where your boundaries lie. And this is so important in a relationship. And as a man, developing your masculinity, that I've devoted an entire 5-hour module to this in the course Rock Solid Relationships. So if you want to dive deeper into assertiveness, uprooting the toxic shame that is at the base of it, and then allowing you, once you're able to undo the toxic shame, then being assertive is just a natural outflow of who you are, because you're naturally going to be aware of your boundaries and you have no anxiety around that. If that's what you'd like to get more into, the course Rock Solid Relationships has an entire module devoted just to assertiveness. And then remember, there's a 5-module sequence on toxic shame in which the assertiveness module is embedded. Okay, so that's the fifth point. So just as a recap, the first point is getting clear on your values. Okay, it's important if you want to be a good person, to know what good means. Okay, you got to have well thought out clarity around your values. The second is that as a good man who is sexually attractive, that you are comfortable with your sexuality. You're sexually comfortable, that you see sex as a healthy biological urge and need. And the third point is that you're easygoing and laid back about everything that is not a non-negotiable life or death thing. The fourth is that you're adventurous, that you're leaning into adventure and risk. And the fifth is that you are assertive and that you're comfortable with being assertive and that you've undone a lot of, if not all of the toxic shame around being assertive in your relationship or with other people in social settings. Okay, so quick story about how this can work is a client named Andrew that I've worked with who was raised in a pretty toxic family and family background, just like social setting, where it was a lot of radical feminism. And he was raised by his mother and aunts, and he had all these sisters, and he was the only male in that family unit and in his extended family in that city. So he was constantly being fed this message that being masculine was bad and shameful, and that the masculine urges are evil in some way, and that they need to be curbed and controlled. And he grew up with this into his 20s. He found me in his early 20s. And when we started working together, he was incredibly stilted and awkward around people and always second guessing his words and even the way he dressed and his mannerisms. And as we worked together through a therapeutic process and eventually got that kind of financial independence, which allowed him to move out of the town that he grew up in and out of that toxic environment. And then he was able to travel the world in a way. He did a round the world trip. And I think he put aside 6 months to do this. I was able to do it between, I think, his sort of gap year between starting his career and ending university, or I think he was in grad school, finishing that, and then before he took up his position, doing this around the world trip. And then eventually he liked it so much that he changed his career and became a digital nomad. And Andrew, through his travels and through this kind of liberation from that toxic family environment and the societal environment there, because he was traveling, he was discovering all of these different value systems, and all of these people in all of these different countries and cities around the world had very different ways of viewing the world, and they were all okay. And he went to places that were more sexually liberal, and so he enjoyed that they were more sexually open, they were non-judgmental about sexuality, and that was really refreshing for him, being raised in a very Puritan environment, and seeing that the whole society didn't crumble as a result, that in fact they were more joyful and they were happier as a result of being more comfortable with their sexuality. Not that these places were devoid of sexual shame, but that they were more open and more comfortable with sexuality and sexual expression than where he grew up. And then finding that because he was forced to travel on a shoestring budget, really, that he was able, all of those fears and stresses that came with him being this uptight, nice guy, he had to let go of because it's just dealing with the stresses of travel. This was pre-COVID. And he developed a kind of easygoing, and he was going to countries where there was more of a laid back mentality around things, where everyone wasn't on time for everything, and they were more enjoying life in the moment. So they were able to be more mindful and present in the moment instead of stressed out about getting to places on time and, what if, all of the negative consequences of not obeying the certain laws. So, jaywalking wasn't such a big deal as it was when he was afraid to even cross the road where he grew up because his family told him that it was too dangerous. The road was too dangerous. Even when he was 16 years old, he felt stressed. And I understood that because I kind of grew up with that sort of mentality as well. Being afraid of taking the subway as a 16-year-old for me, as an example. And then he was able to, because he was traveling as a solo traveler, that is in itself was already kind of adventurous. But then being surrounded by other backpackers and that backpacker culture being generally more adventurous, and just months of that, just sort of then bringing out of him those parts of himself that were already more easygoing and adventurous and sexually comfortable, that became a way of just filling out his personality so that these parts now felt more accepted, more liberated, and he felt more integrated and whole and happy as a result, of course, and then realizing the tremendous power that comes from that kind of freedom. Okay, so make sure that you don't swing the other way. Just as I'm thinking about another client of mine that was much longer earlier in my career, that coming out of a very sexually repressive society and family structure and family setting, and teaching him about being easygoing and sexually open, adventurous, because he didn't do that first thing. He didn't get clear on what his values were. He went the whole other way and it was like anything goes. And I kind of understand that swing. You kind of have to overcorrect a little bit, but he went way over. That there was no morality. And then he ended up staying with that. And after years of thinking there's no morality, there's no good or evil, there's no such things, no concepts, these don't make sense, they're all relative, that it ends up becoming just dog eat dog. It's like red in tooth and claw. I've talked a lot about fully embracing that type of view of the world and of good and evil and good and bad, that he became quite toxic in himself. So sort of acidic, eating him from the inside out. If there's no good, then there's no love, and there's no room for compassion, and there's no room for empathy, and it's just get what you can and get, and so it's just acquisitiveness. And that's not the right way either. So that very first point of getting clear on what your values are, what is good for you, what is bad for you, how are you defining good and evil, what constitutes right and wrong? And I would start with the bigger question of what is good. And that's different from what is right. Start with what is good. Focus on that first. And then it'll become easier to figure out what is right. He didn't figure out any of that. So he just went all into a kind of nihilism. And this kind of nihilism ate him up from the inside. So I want to warn you about skipping that first step of getting clear on what your values are. Again, I've devoted episodes 4 to 6 on values in the context of a long-term relationship. But I also have courses that guide you step by step through thinking about unearthing your current value system, because it's important to know where you're starting from, and getting that self-awareness. And then from your unconscious as well, getting clear on what your values would need to be in order to find and create the life that you want. And in the next episode, I'll be covering the how. How do you arrive at this type of personality or this character? How can I become more sexually comfortable, become more easygoing, become more adventurous and assertive, and get clear on my values? How do I do that? I'll cover that in the next episode. Come back for the next episode for that. Thank you so much for following along so far. Thank you so much for all of your engagement. It'd mean a lot to me if you were to share this episode and this podcast with anyone you think would benefit from it, as well as leaving a rating on Apple Podcasts. That always helps. And thanks so much for all your engagement. Thanks so much for listening. All right, so I'll see you in the next episode. David Tian signing out.